Which, oh, they do pan, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're going to tell you not to go way in the back.
Okay, all right, but I can walk around.
Speakers do that.
Yeah.
All right, are you ready? We're 1, 2, 3, we're on. Hello, everybody. The last day, third to the last speaker, although he's doing the keynote. I'm very honored to have in our presence Dr. Joshua Sparrow. He came all the way from Boston, and he's going to tell you more about himself. But the poor man sat next to me at, what was it? First Five
Summit.
First Five Summit. And I said, oh, you're Dr. Sparrow, because I've been in his presence before. So I am just honored that he's here. I constantly use the word Touchpoint, and that's where he's from. And so this is like a touch point right here to have Dr. Sparrow in the house. So thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Kathy.
you very much.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for inviting me to be in the presence of all of you. And thank you to First Five Santa Clara County and to my dear friend, Jolene Smith, who will be coming for the keynote and who has also been such an important part of bringing us all together. I would like to start, and this never works, so don't feel bad, but I would like to start by saying it's very lonely up here, and I can't really go too far because we are also welcoming all of these people watching on their phones and tablets and computers through that camera there, so I can't even really come back to you without them missing out. So there are lots of completely refreshed seats. Don't have to be in front. There's some people to hide behind if you're more comfortable. And if you're comfortable exactly where you are, then please do stay exactly where you are and don't feel bad. But I just want to offer you, it never works, see, but I always feel like I should say that. So I don't know if you read the Inclusion Collaborative's vision and mission, but I thought it was so beautiful. Maybe you've been reading it before every workshop and plenary all week long, but I think it's almost like a prayer that brings us all together to a good place. So is it okay if I read it? Inclusion Collaborative. Why? Every individual, regardless of abilities and disabilities, has the right to full access to quality inclusive learning and community environments. Mission: to build a culture that values all children by strengthening, sustaining, and ensuring inclusive practices. Vision: our community embraces diversity and supports lifelong quality inclusion for everyone. That sure makes me feel good. The core values are engagement, collaboration, and partnerships among families, educational systems, and community agencies. And that really spoke to me because that's so much of what the work of the center that I'm at does or tries to do. Full access for everyone in community and learning environments. Leadership that models and advocates for inclusive practices in all community venues. I think a lot about leadership and how I fail at it every day. But this is a wonderful aspect of leadership to aspire to. Accessible and integrated services, training and education on inclusive practices, diversity in all forms, inclusion benefits everyone, relationship-based practices with the child and family at the center, and the National Center for Parent, Family, and Community Engagement of the Office of Head Start and the Office of Child Care, which our Brazelton Touchpoint Center leads, just released in the past month a series of relationship-based competencies for a number of different roles in early childhood education and care, including family support workers, teachers, home visitors, and others. And you can find it on the Head Start website, which is eclkc.gov. And if it helps you to remember the order of the letters, I think it's Early Childhood Learning and Knowledge Center. And finally, continuous improvement through a focus on results. And that's what makes it all far more than aspiration to actually making it happen. So I think we're going to talk about, I think we're going to talk about adolescence, right? Is that what you're here for? Talk about adolescence? So How many of you work with adolescents? A lot of you, yeah. How many of you have an adolescent at home right now? Not me. How many of you have raised an adolescent? So we kind of got everybody there. And how many of you were once an adolescent yourselves? Yeah. No, not you, no. How about all of you out in our TV audience? Raise your hands. Yeah, I think I got you all on that last one. So I realized that I end up talking a lot about emotions, about feelings, and that can be hard to do. So rather than brace yourself or shut down and withdraw, I would ask you to see if there's a way in which you can be open, because I think much of the raising of adolescents that we have done will do, it's really with our personhood, and the energy for that comes from our emotions, and there sure are a lot of them in working with or raising adolescents. To introduce myself, I wanted to say that before I went to medical school, I was a preschool teacher, and also to tell you about the vision of the Brazelton Touchpoint Center, which is a world in which all children grow up to be adults who can cope with adversity, strengthen their communities, constructively participate in civic life, steward our planet's resources, and experience the joys of nurturing the next generation to do the same. Now, historically, a lot of the focus of the Brazelton Touchpoint Center has been on the perinatal period and 0 to 3, and in 2001, Barry Brazelton and I wrote a book about touchpoints in the 3 to 6 year period. But when I first met him in 1991, the Touchpoints book had not come out yet, the first one on birth to 3, and he showed me the galleys that was going to press, and I was really honored that he showed it to me, and when I gave it back to him, he said, well, what did you think? And I said, I think you can apply this to the whole lifespan. So that's why we're here talking about the touchpoints of adolescence today. And when you look at our vision, you can see how clearly each of these apply to adolescence, and some of them we will be digging in deeper on over the course of our time together this morning. So we'll talk a little bit about stressors as the challenge that we are looking for ways to solve, and we'll start by talking about the stressors on families. Now, Barry Brazelton, who died on March 13th of this year, a few months before his 100th birthday, which would have been on May 10th, yeah, he would have been 100. And he told me actually 8 days before he died, he said, Josh, I'm gonna live to be 100. But he had this look on his face like, but I don't know how much more beyond that. And he talked about going around the country, which he did for decades, and said he collected 12 stressors on families. And sometimes we couldn't remember all 12, but here are some of the high points. And if you look at these, workplace demands on families, it's different now because people bring their work home or their work has invaded their homes because of digital technology. But there are at least as many demands, if not more. I would say the change in demands are on our capacity for attention to our children. Because when our phone is in our pocket or on the dining room table or upstairs, we're partly with our phones. And guess what? Our adolescent children are too. Changes in family structures and roles. One of the ways in which that has changed is immigration policy, which has, until we're able to stop it, further disrupted and separated families. Increased family mobility and isolation. One of the main drivers has been looking for work. wherever it is and moving away from extended family. And in many cultures, extended family actually is the nuclear family. And now, of course, there's more isolation for those who feel that it's not safe to come out. Increased economic challenges for families. So this was one he collected back in the 1990s. It's worse now. There may be closer to full employment, but actual purchasing power has declined since the 1970s. Stressed education, health, and social services, I don't have to tell you about that. The erosion of family traditions, neighborhoods, and community connections is particularly key to the challenges of raising adolescents. And I'm going to come back to that, and I hope close with some simple things that some of us may be in a position to be able to do. Then, so that was Barry's collection. And then, while we're going down into the quicksands of depression, we'll come back out of it, don't worry. But I got one more slide that's a downer, and then hopefully this will be all uphill from here. So now we've got all of this. And I put this in front of you because when I listen to adolescents, many of them are really thinking about this. And they're thinking about, well, so what's my path? What future can I have or hope for? And also, if adolescents in our mainstream dominant culture have for a long time questioned authority, these things put much more power behind that questioning. Like, what is wrong with your generation? How could you possibly have changed the world to leave us with this? So climate change, the conflicts around the world between different ethnic groups or tribal groups, the inequities of economics, which are far worse now, you all know. The haves and have-nots, far more have-nots. The haves have far more. And then there's globalization, digital technology, artificial intelligence, which certainly have risks, and there are probably a range of views on the opportunities that they present. And then more specifically, stressors on adolescents today, which I've been collecting, and I'd love actually to pause here and have you and those in our TV audience help me build this out. So this isn't necessarily in the order of importance, and for different adolescents, these may not be the challenges at all, and some may matter the more. I started with social media, FOMO, fear of missing out. Well, I would say probably for many of us when we were teenagers, we wouldn't have known what FOMO stood for. A fear of missing out, though, might have been not getting invited to a party on Saturday night. Do you remember that? That really hurt. But it's not like living with it second by second when your teacher collects all of the smartphones in a basket at the beginning of class. Instagram appearance anxiety. And you know that the cosmetic industry is just ballooning with products to improve, quote unquote, appearances for selfies for Instagram. And in some Asian countries, there is a massive increase in plastic surgeries that are being offered to conform to an Instagram image. And they often also pretty clearly take the form of a kind of erasure of one's identity, belongings. Cyberbullying and sexting. I've certainly had adolescents on the inpatient child psychiatry unit who had made suicide attempts and could not see how they could get back into the world because of cyberbullying or sexting, and there have been lawsuits against the perpetrators after the criminal suits where sexting has led to adolescent suicide. So it is real. Pheromone deprivation. Pheromone deprivation. What do I mean by that? What do you think? What do I mean by pheromone deprivation while we're thinking about social media? There's no human contact, right. So human contact is this fascinating, complex, rich thing that includes seeing your face, hearing your voice without its being mediated, mirroring the things that happen with your tilting your head or your slumping your shoulders or you're straightening yourself up, the volume of your voice, because I can't adjust it when you're really with me, and the neurohormones, the chemicals that we actually transmit to each other that smartphones are not going to make happen. So for generations that have become far more comfortable communicating with each other by texting than by being with each other, they are missing out on huge, massive amounts of social information. So they're not getting that about those they're with, and they're not getting it back. And worse than that, they are growing up with this deprivation, not learning how to give out those signals and how to make sense of, understand, and respond to those signals. It's just not part of what they're going to be able to learn because they're not getting it. And one of the clearest sources of documentation on this is Sherry Turkle's book called Reclaiming Conversation. It's really quite striking because she's gone around and talked to superintendents and principals and teachers and adolescents, middle school students, and consistently the kids say, we're not going to have potentially conflictual conversations where there are emotions in person. That's too hard and we don't know how to do that. We'll do that by text. And we make it over before it really is by some sort of fairly pat response in text. And the teachers say, with regard to social interactional development, these 13-year-olds are functioning at a 7-year-old level. So we have this pretty dramatic developmental delay that is the result of human communication being funneled in through this very narrow channel that only lets in a little bit of information, and it's primarily texting and maybe Instagram and maybe Snapchat for now. So nonverbal communication, developmental delay. And part of what is so concerning about this is without those skills, we can't raise our children. And so much of the rest of this talk about parents and adolescents is about how we use those skills and try to find those skills when they get disrupted by the predictable developmental crises of adolescence. We need those skills to be in conversation with our children, with our adolescents, to raise them. We also need those skills to be in conversations where there's disagreement, where there's tension, where there are divergent perspectives, where there's conflict, so that we can resolve them. And if the human race loses this function, I think we'll lose the function to be able to move through conflict to get to resolution where we can all inhabit this planet together. So I think it's very grave. And then there's climate change from the adolescent perspective of, I don't think I'm going to have children because the planet will be uninhabitable. For them, I got an email from a good friend of mine earlier this week who is older than me, who said, I don't even have to think about this, but I know my kids are going to have kids. And so this is now not a, far down the road. It's actually the generation that our children will be raising, and our children, direct experience. Guns in schools. Well, there are all kinds of ways in which this is a challenge for adolescents. But again, if you think about the historical questioning of authority and guns in schools, this is another place where it would be understandable for adolescents to be feeling like these guys have really put their moral authority to be able to tell us anything in the gutter, right? What are they thinking? Then sexual orientation, gender identity. There was an article in Teen Vogue, which I don't usually read, but someone sent it to me. In fact, I'm not sure I even knew it really existed, but it does. And it was by parents of children who are transgender. And I would urge you to read it because it's just very simple and very clear and from a parent's perspective. And it was signed by real parents. I was flipping through the pages of signatures. I couldn't get through all the pages. I mean, there were hundreds, maybe more, I don't know how many, of parents who had signed this. So this is a challenge, not just for adolescents and their parents who are gender exploring or gender transitioning or gender fluid, but for all of us. Because we had, in our mainstream culture, shut down awareness and thought about this. There are many other cultures where there was no assumption that gender was binary to begin with, so that there was more collective knowledge about a fuller range of gender identity and gender expression. And then the culture wars, culture erosion, values diffusion. Well, one of the things that holds families together and keeps adolescents on a path of learning and development and health are the cultural beliefs around them. And here, this may sound terribly simplistic, but I think there's enough truth to it to say, we have culture, I think of as something that we all make together in the groups that we're connected to, and it evolves and changes over time as we adapt to the context that we're in, to the resources we have or don't have, and the challenges that we face. And I think culture gets transmitted from one generation to another, ideally holding on to the stuff that's protected our children and support our children's growth, and then letting go of the things that actually weren't so helpful. It doesn't always work that way. I don't mean to idealize culture, but that's how I think of how culture works. It's like a book of wisdom that we write and pass down, except we get to keep on changing it. We kind of have to keep on changing it. And then the wisdom comes from us where we are, close in, where there's real lived experience and knowledge and wisdom. And then there's corporate culture or commercial culture, which is much further away from my children or your children. And corporate culture's goal is not like our vision or like the vision of the Inclusion Collaborative. Corporate culture's goal is not to support children's health, learning, and development and thriving. It's to sell people stuff. So the values and beliefs with a very loud bullhorn that adolescents are being drenched with are about selling stuff. So there's an organization called Campaign for a Commercial-Free Childhood that has documented this very well. And there are a number of research studies that have shown how specific advertisements have intentionally been designed to increase anxiety about appearance, which can drive, I'm not saying the advertisements cause anorexia nervosa, but it's in the environment that children are trying to figure out, how do I look and what does that represent and is that okay? And to stimulate other kinds of anxiety, because anxiety is a powerful motivator for buying stuff. So, stressors for parents of adolescents. You tell me. Yeah, some people are shuddering, yeah. So what are the stressors for parents of adolescents?
I just say I'm here because I now have 4 grandchildren who are teenagers. I'm reliving.
Oh, that's why you shudder. So,
One of them is the social media. My daughter called
If you're asking a question virtually, our virtual people want to hear it. So
Yeah,
we're going to go ahead.
I'll repeat it, so, and that way we can also check and make sure I understood. So you are the person who was shuddering that I noted, if that's okay to say. You are the person who was shuddering when I said stressors on parents, and you said you were here because you now are a grandparent of adolescents, and that social media is a stress on your adult child raising adolescents, and therefore on you. Yeah. Yeah, this is, 8 days before Barry Brazelton died, he said in this meeting, parents aren't worried about the same things that they were when I was in practice, because he didn't practice for 50 years, but it had been a while. But we had him go out on a listening tour in more recent years, 80, 95, 96, 97, he was out listening to parents. He said, today they're worried about digital technology and social media. They're worried about guns, and they're worried about sexual orientation and gender identity. This is not what he was hearing 20 years ago. I'm not sure he knew what social media or digital technology was. What I would fill in for our TV audience who maybe can't tell us, so hopefully you'll be putting things into the chat that we'll see eventually. Parents are worried about getting through it at all. The stakes of adolescence are much higher because their sphere of movement and influence has vastly increased. So with babies and toddlers and school-age children, you worry about their survival, but you also have a fair amount of supervisory control. And they have fewer potential weapons that society condones them having access to. But in adolescence, I feel it's very unfortunate. In our country, we think that alcohol use is some sort of necessary rite of passage. I don't get why that should be. But for somehow that's gotten completely normalized. I really question that, especially for adolescents. Cars, and just being out and about without knowing where they are, and access to the internet and therefore to the wider world and all of the people in it, good and not so good. And yet that is the necessary step in the evolution of many species, moving from being cared for and nurtured and supervised to developing the capacity to do it without all of those supports and without all that containment. And that, I think, is the heart of what stresses parents is. Their child is moving into learning how to do without the supervision and supports and containment, because that's a big developmental agenda for adolescents. And yet, they're not ready. And the way that they'll learn how to do it, think about your own adolescence. I asked you if you ever were adolescents. Was there anything that you did that probably wasn't such a good idea when you were an adolescent and you learned not to do it because you did it? Yeah. Yeah. So learning through trial and error is part of how we move in that direction, but the stakes are high. So what is adolescence? A historical invention. The term really wasn't around in earlier centuries, just like the word parenting. Do you know when that word used as a verb first appeared? 1970s. 1970s. And with the invention of the word parenting, suddenly it became this very precious and pressured job for parents, with all kinds of experts who could sell you things so that you could get it right because they knew and you didn't. But adolescence was not an idea. It wasn't a thing. When we lived in agrarian economies where everybody, worked in the farm or hunted and foraged or what they did, and you didn't need this differentiation of ages. With industrialization and division of labor, you also had division of age groups, and that's where we started having education dividing up kids by age group. That's where it all began. So It is a biological phenomenon in some very clear ways, and it begins earlier than we often think, with puberty being set off, often at age 8 or 9 before the external signs are present. But some of the ways we think about adolescence are cultural, social, political, and they change as society changes. So it's a cultural construct. It is, as I said, a neurohormonal and physiological phenomenon, but which can go in a lot of different directions depending on how we define it culturally and historically. Not sure, but it starts at 9 years old and ends at 35. Maybe I'm being optimistic. Maybe you get to be a child again after 35. That's what I'm hoping for. Here today, gone tomorrow, maybe. So before saying more about adolescence, I just wanted to go through this because in this inclusion conference, I feel like a lot of unintended harm happens when we talk about groups. And we're used to thinking about groups based on race or ethnicity or religion or ability. Maybe ability often doesn't get thought of so much. Age, we think about discrimination against the elderly. We don't think so much about discrimination against the young. We don't think a lot about adolescents as a group who get stereotyped and labeled and shoved aside and left out of conversations. And the other thing that troubles me about them is any group that gets a label, any of the ones that I've just alluded to, everyone inside that group is a unique individual. And you don't really know a whole heck of a lot about anybody on the basis of that label. You might know, for a number of the groups I mentioned, that they are likely to have experienced oppression and discrimination and inequitable access to resources currently and historically. That might be something that might sort of cover a lot of folks in the group. But aside from that, I think it is a part of racism to think that labels like this actually tell us anything. So I would say we have the same problem with adolescence. And during the 60s and 70s and 80s in particular, adolescents got a bad rap, and all kinds of assumptions were made about adolescents, and that, I think, alienated them, made the adults frightened of them, and it became a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, which I'll touch on again. So I would just say, let's not groupify and otherize, and I think we will be much better with adolescents, and they'll be much better with us if we are really open to being surprised and to be in a mode of curiosity and discovery. Who are you? Who are you becoming? And to have a pretty blank slate about what that might mean. And I just listed a number of the variables, but there are so many more. So as Kathy said, the focus of my work is on touchpoints, and I will tell you a bit later what a touchpoint is, but I wanted to first say why this approach, this relational and developmental approach. And one aspect of it is to reaffirm the expertise of parents. So why does that matter? Why do parents need to feel that they are experts as they raise their children?
Because we have experiences that we went through.
With your children.
And in our own lives.
In our own lives.
We want to pass on
Yeah.
what we've learned.
Right. So we've had experiences in our own lives that we want to pass on. Yeah. And some strand of that, and I'm not sure that this is what you're thinking of, but I will add, is the continuity of cultural identity. So part of what parents would like to bring to their children and have respected by people around them, like their teachers and others, is weaving them into this thread of continuity of cultural identity. And there have been a number of studies that have shown that that sense of, I know who I am, I know who my people are, I know where I come from, and I know where we're going, is a protective factor against suicide and against alcohol and substance use. So yeah, and it's a really wonderful point. And in fact, no one's ever said that before, so thank you. I mean, but it's a really wonderful point because, yeah, that's something the parent is going to know and know in their heart and their soul as well as in their head, that a professional can't possibly know or bring to that adolescent. What are some of the other reasons why it really matters for parents to be affirmed in their sense of their expertise about raising their children? Affirmation strengthens people, yes. And Lord knows when you're raising an adolescent, there might be times when you need to feel strong. Yeah. So I often talk about reaffirming parents' sense of expertise when I talk about newborns or infants and toddlers, because especially if it's the first child, it's all new. Well, if it's your first adolescent, it's all new. But even if you've raised a couple of adolescents, you know that each one is different. And the differences really become clear in adolescence. And the differences may be personality, temperament, the kinds of intelligence they have, the kinds of learning style they have. So it's all new. And when I try to help people understand, when I'm talking about babies and toddlers and the importance of reaffirming expertise, the best example I've found is actually about an adolescent. So you picture the 13-year-old girl rushing to the front door on a Saturday night, very briefly maybe turning around to say, "Bye, Ma, see you later, I'm out the door." And so what does the mother do? Well, she probably wants to know, where are you going? Who are you going with? When will you be back? Are you going to be in a car? Who will be driving it? They don't worry about that in New York, but they worry about that here. And are you going to someone's house? Will the parents be there? Those are all the questions that parents need to feel they are entitled to ask. And if they feel uncertain about, well, wait a second, I don't know if I get to say that as a parent at this point. Is it like really all none of my business anymore? It doesn't happen. And then, in fact, just yesterday, someone in Texas was telling me about this with their daughter. Same thing. She'd run away. She'd come back to get money, and asked her dad for the keys to the car. And she took off for another 4 months. And what she needed to hear was, I know you're not going to like this right now, and it's not going to feel like how I love you, but I do love you, and part of being really clear and being sure you feel it is by saying, you're not getting the keys to the car. And that is one of the things that shifts as one raises a child, is that in the first 9 months, it's all about holding and cooing and cuddling. And at 9 months, the first time the baby crawls towards the electrical socket and then looks back at you to see what you're going to do about it, it's also like, no, you're not getting the keys to the car. So if you don't feel affirmed or expert, and you probably won't the first time that your daughter runs to the door to do that, what happens? You might say something like, you are grounded for the rest of your life, right? It's like, what am I going to say? Well, I'll say that. And then what happens when you say that? You totally lost all moral authority. Like, really? You can't do that. You know you can't do that, and there's no way I'm going to let you do that. And so why should I take any of your limits? Why should I take any of them seriously? In the book that Barry Brazelton and I wrote on discipline, there's a whole section, and we wrote it for younger children, but it really applies to adolescents, and a lot of it came from my work with adolescents on an inpatient child psychiatry unit, about how the consequence has to fit what the transgression was for you to retain your moral authority. And if you go way far stricter than what the actual issue was, the child's just going to say, I wish you were out of my life because really you don't make any sense. So, but why did you do that? It's out of fear. It's out of like, I don't feel like I have the expertise to handle this. I think part of why parents may not feel expert is because they are navigating predictable developmental crises, but it's also because of what I said about this relatively new idea of parenting invented in the 1970s, which is that there is a science of parenting that I'm supposed to know about, but I don't, and people who read the books that I haven't do, and people who write the books, those are the ones who know, and I don't. And I think that that has really interfered with parents feeling expert. And although there may be some good guidance in some books and that kind of thing, and I just mentioned one actually, I think the overall effect of creating this system of beliefs that there's parenting science that lives outside of families, outside of communities, outside of homes, interferes with parents feeling empowered to say, this is my family. As you said, this is where I come from. This is what I experienced as a child, for good or for bad sometimes. This is my sense of who I am. This is what I want to impart to my child. This is where I know we're going. These are the dangers and opportunities where I live. And that is how I get to decide. And the books are not going to help me because they're far too far away. So I basically just said this, but it is this idea that there is a single science of parenting that undermines parents' sense of expertise. And I think we do overestimate how much any of us who are professionals can do, because the dosage of professionals, is it once a week? Is it, if you're in a high school, the teacher gets maybe 5 hours a week, but there's 25 other kids. We have to, I think, pump up the importance of helping adolescents navigate these challenges of family and informal supports in the community, and all kinds of not formally educational or not formally clinical supports. So, when we can reaffirm parents' sense of expertise, they feel more competent, more effective, and the research says they do better. And I think if you're feeling like I can probably figure this out, you're less likely to say you're grounded for the rest of your life. So if you don't remember anything else, and people I think only remember one or two things from a talk this long, I think this may be the most important point of all. And I kind of just said it in one way, but I'll say it in another. Raising an adolescent, a child of any age, is primarily an adaptive challenge, not a technical one. So a technical challenge would be like the light bulb going out. So the solution is a technical solution. All you need to do is get a light bulb and a ladder and 11 psychiatrists. And it's simple. And even getting a rocket to the moon is a technical challenge. It's a complicated technical challenge. But you've basically got a closed system of moving parts. And what the parts are supposed to do and how they're supposed to interact with each other is entirely predictable, unless something in the outside environment, has been inaccurately predicted. An adolescent in a family, an adolescent in a school, one of us in the agency that we works in, these are systems too, like a rocket ship, but we are the moving parts. And it is not at all clear or predictable how we're going to interact with each other and what's going to happen when we do. And so if you understand that raising an adolescent is an adaptive challenge in this system of humans, then what does it tell us about what needs to happen? Well, we need to be able to tune in, attend, stay in conversation, so we get really good data about what's going on, and we put back really good data and really good energy about where we could all move together. And I think that applies for our work as adults in the organizations where we work too. So that you can't control where a complex system is going to go, but you can set the conditions and create context to up the odds that it's going to move in a good place that most people in the system are going to feel good about. And if you think about it, I don't know how many people would want to be able to entirely determine and control who their adolescent ended up being, because you wouldn't discover what they brought to it. And you wouldn't discover what could be brought out by the other humans in the systems that they'll be in, whether it's the rest of the family or the neighborhood or the school or the other institutions that they're involved in. So because I was a preschool teacher, I was trying to think about, is there something about raising a child that isn't adaptive? And I thought, maybe changing diapers. Maybe changing diapers. And I was really good at changing diapers. I could do it between my knees, I could do it on my shoulder, I could do it on a bus. And I thought about it and I realized even changing diapers is not a technical problem. Guess why? Well, because they're all different. Yeah. Right. Some stay still, some wiggle and roll around. They're all different. And also, I know you guys don't want to talk about it, but let's talk about it. It depends what's in the diaper. Right? But the thing for this whole idea is it depends what's in the adolescent, right? What are they bringing? What's in us? So driving a car sounds like it could be technical. It totally depends on where the adolescent is in their development, what their capacity is for attention, for impulse control, for judgment, where they're driving, what the driving culture is like. Like, you might think California drivers are crazy. I think it's like so zen here compared to Boston. I'm like, whoa, I better like really watch how I'm driving because they're gonna think that I'm really a horrible person. But I'm just driving like a Bostonian, right? So there are all kinds of things that even teaching your kid to drive are gonna be influenced by. So this doesn't mean there's nothing you can do and nothing to know, but it means what you want to do and what you want to know has to be about setting context, creating conditions, and being ready for the emergent, unpredictable. So you're in this mode of curiosity, discovery, and ready for surprise. So now, what is a touch point? Well, when I was taking the course that didn't really count in medical school on human development, you had to memorize the phases or stages for Freud or Piaget or Erikson, but they never really talked about, well, what gets one phase started, why does it stop, and where does it go? And yet, if we are all really devoting our lives to supporting change, to supporting growth, supporting development, we could really be scratching our heads about what are the mechanisms by which change happens. And so Barry Brazelton wondered about this as he saw 25,000 children and their families over 50 years. And he realized that it's not a linear process. It's a discontinuous process with fits and starts, bursts and pauses, disorganization and reorganization. It's kind of like making a simple Lego structure or Tinker Toy structure, and then taking it apart and then putting it together in a way where it can do new and different things. And that is how development works. There is a period of taking apart what is there so that there can be new skills and capacities when you put it back together again. So from younger children, one example is the 4-month-old who had learned how to feed well. And then between 4 and 5 months of age, many lose interest. They'll take a suck or two and then they'll look all around the room and they're done. So that's the disorganization in one developmental domain, but guess why and guess what's happening? Their ability to focus their eyes moves out from this distance to the periphery of a normal-sized room, 6 or 8 feet. So suddenly it's like they were being born all again, and they've got all this new visual information, and it's much more interesting, and their developmental agenda is, I got to learn about that. And in a way, I think that's a really good example for thinking about adolescent touch points, just as another early one is, because in this example, we go back to what I said earlier about how the developmental agenda about adolescence is to venture further out into the world, to learn about all kinds of new things. And it leads to disorganization, like, I'm really fascinated by sex. Let's just say it. So I can't really concentrate on schoolwork right now, so I'm really concentrating on that, right? It's like this, it's sort of like the 4-month-old, and I don't mean, I hate it when people say adolescence is like the second toddlerhood. I think that if I were an adolescent, that would make me feel just so condescended to. But I think all the way through development, there are these periods of something coming apart because there's something else that we're working on. Another early in life, between 9 and 13 months, babies who had been sleeping through the night stop sleeping through the night, and they'll wake up at the end of every sleep cycle. They'll wake up instead of going back down to sleep again, every 3 or 4 hours, 3 or 4 times a night. And this is correlated with, guess what new emergent skill? Walking. And it is theorized, not proven, but theorized that in order to lay down the molecular traces of memory of the motor movements that are going to come together for walking, you have to be in light sleep. And that the brain, because we know we learn and remember during sleep. So, always tell your students, don't compromise on your sleep because you're learning and remembering then. So it looks as if it may be in light sleep that babies are remembering the beginnings of the motor movements that they're putting together. But it means their sleep will be more vulnerable. So again, it's pretty easy to see how neurobiological, neurohormonal changes with increases in sex hormones, testosterone, and estrogens in the pituitary and adrenal gland, correlates of the sex hormones, and changes in the brain in adolescence, that there are going to be some things that are tough for them to do, like self-regulation. And often during developmental touch points, when there's some wonderful new exciting skill emerging, one of the functions that often comes apart is self-regulation. It's probably the most common all the way through. So this is just a schematic way of thinking about it, and I had one for driving. Now, just to tell you, this hasn't been looked at in chimpanzee adolescents, but it has been looked at in chimpanzee infants and mothers, and a very similar phenomenon is there. The mothers actually know when their babies are becoming disorganized, and they scoop them up and hold them close. And I make that point because in different human cultures, we do that differently. So in some human cultures, we scoop up our babies and hold them close. Or we hold our adolescents tight, right? There are some communities, religious and cultural, where we really reel them in. And then there are others where we let them go. I'm not saying that there's a right or wrong, but there's variation there. In this species, they hold them tight, and the babies have this very strong palmar grasp, so they grip onto their mother's chest hair. That's another little difference. And another difference is that the mothers don't call up the pediatrician to find out what's wrong. My baby's suddenly having trouble with self-regulation, which is like more crying. And he quantified the self-dysregulation, Franz Pluy, who did the research, as increased crying and clinging and seeking of physical attention. So we have evidence of touch points in other species and in other countries, certainly. And here's what happens with these touch points is when the adolescent's developmental domain disorganizes in the service of coming back together again in a new way that supports a new skill, During the period of disorganization, who else gets disorganized? Well, that's kind of what we've been talking about. The parents, the teachers, the others around them get disorganized as well. And yet, one of the really important things about humans being so effective in creating social units, whether it's a family or a village or a neighborhood or a community or a school, is that in social units, we create norms and conventions and expectations and behavior checks and supports and aspirations that sort of keep us all going more or less, down the same good path to good things, hopefully. Doesn't always work that way, I know, but that's kind of the idea of, human social capacity. And that is what gets adolescents through their developmental crises that we call touchpoints, are these guardrails that we create around them. So I think what to do about this part of this talk is we have to honor the fact that we're going to get disorganized, right? We will. We have to get ourselves together. We have to look at what does it take for us to get ourselves together. Well, often in parents who are partnering together, in couples, this blows up the parent-partnering relationship. And typically in couples, people get polarized in things like, I'm the one who puts the cap on the toothpaste and you're the one who never does. I'm the one who you're laughing, like we all do that. Or I'm the one who shuts off the lights and you don't. Or you're the one whose car is a mess and my car is like super clean. Or whatever. I mean, it's like, it's pretty typical. I'm the, loose one and you're the obsessional. I mean, all this stuff. And we tend to go further apart than we actually are, because when we see the other parent partner going in that direction, we want to make sure we got the other bases covered. So when the child's developmental disorganization comes up, guess what happens? We go further away from each other and we get into struggles about this is what's going on and this is what I think we should do. So there are a set of pretty clear steps about taking a deep breath, not saying what you're going to do when the child, goes out the door before you can stop her, and saying something like, I am so upset with your behavior that I'm going to have to talk with your dad about what the consequences are going to be, and we'll let you know. We'll get back to you. So that you're making it clear to yourself that you're not going to impulsively act on what you think the specific consequence could be, but you're going to be sure that you get to a united front. You don't have this problem when you're raising a child on your own, but you have the challenge of the child sensing the ways in which it might be hard for you to get the containment of a social unit around the child. So, myths about adolescent development. As we said, it is not linear, not continuous. Why is this backwards? I have to put them all in there. There we go. Each stage of progress is followed by another. Not really. It's disorganization and reorganization. It's not linear. Adolescents need to separate and become independent. This, I think, is a cultural fiction. This fits with the culture of nuclear families. And nuclear families didn't really exist before industrialization at the end of the 19th century, when you needed to get some people out to work in factories and some people to stay home to raise the next generation of factory workers. And so the nuclear family served that economy really well. But as we've seen over the past 150 years, a whole lot of nuclear families don't really stay nuclear families for very long. Like at least 50% of them don't remain nuclear families. So it's a sort of historical experiment rather than, an ideal standard. It's an experiment for this period of time. As the world changes, there will be other experiments. So in this notion of nuclear families is this idea of adolescence, which also came online in our, conscience in this culture at about the same time. There's this period where adolescents need to buff up their CVs so that they can go to college, right? So they're kind of, checked out of real life, and that's what they got to do. And then we have to let them launch. Well, how many of you who've raised adolescents have had your adult kids kind of circle back around? Yeah, right. And we think, oh, we failed, or that's not the way it's supposed to be. I think what it says is that separation and independence is a myth. I think humans need each other, families need each other. We stay connected to each other. We change the ways in which we connect with each other. We change the roles to some extent. If you think about those of you who have been taking care of elderly parents, it's the same idea. We remain connected. So I think it's a huge problem that we think our job as professionals or as parents is to, kind of get them out of our lives, because that doesn't feel good to anybody. And it doesn't really position us, I think, where we need to be. There we go. So once when I gave a talk like this in Palm Beach a long time ago, afterwards this woman came up to me impeccably dressed in this all-white suit. It really looked like she'd put a lot of time and effort into being impeccable. And it was all white. And she said, "Dr. Sparrow, you've changed my life." And I thought, wow, how often does that happen? And never. And I said, really? Really, little me? Like, how'd that happen? And she said, well, you said this, expect the messiness. And I also think in the sort of mainstream dominant culture, there's so much emphasis on being perfect and looking perfect, and not to pick on anything in particular, but the happiest kid on the block, right? That's so much pressure. And is our job really to force our kids to be the happiest so we win out on our neighbors? Or is happiness a byproduct of some of the other things that happen as we raise our families together? So moving towards expecting the messiness, welcoming, embracing the messiness, staying in it when it comes, this is one of those conflicts that they told me about. Here's one of these hard times where you want to do something that I totally disagree with. Let's stay in that. I didn't fail as a parent. You didn't fail as an adolescent. Here we are in the messiness, which is a part of our growing up together as a family. It's really important, and there's so much in our culture that works against our being able to do that. It also feels so much better, and it's easier to stay present and tuned in when you let there be permission for, there's going to be times where it's a real mess. And I will say I've had a number of deaths among my close people in the past year, including Barry Brazelton, but not just him. And one of the lessons is life is really hard. Life is really hard. It's not for the faint-hearted. And I think that's true for all of us. And once we can sort of find our place, and we're in this life and it's hard, then I think we can find what this writer Nassim Taleb calls anti-fragility. Stronger than strong is anti-fragile. And I'll tell you, the strongest people I know, or the most anti-fragile people I know, are the people who have been, hit the hardest, who have been the most vulnerable. There is a whole other kind of strength that can come from that. So this is a part of that. I also think that if you can expect the messiness, you can stay in the system, which is the family or the school, that holds the child as guardrails moving through this time during which they come apart. Brain development. I sort of touched on this, but adolescent brain development is in some ways different because there are specific things that adolescents are working on. It's designed for additional kinds of learning which make them more vulnerable. And this is why I talk about seeing the system where we are in it and staying in it even when it gets rough. Because the kind of learning they need to do requires our staying in it with them. And here are these things. Increased novelty seeking, increased risk taking, increased experimentation. They're supposed to do that. They would be very dumb adults if they didn't do that. All of you have done that. And that's why you know a lot of the stuff that you know. That's why you won't do a lot of the stuff that you did, right? Novelty seeking, risk taking, experimentation. So I think in the days when adolescents were bad-mouthed, we saw all of this as bad, 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 scary. And instead, and this is a part of staying in the messiness, we can celebrate this and let adolescents know this is your job right now. Seek novelty, take risks, experiment. Find out about this big world, right? There are risks not to take, there are experiments not to conduct. but the move out into the world to get to know the unknown is to celebrate. It's a little scary, right? But I hope all of you have gone on adventures that have been a little scary for you, right? Times when you've started at the bottom of a mountain, right? Or jumped into the ocean, or stepped onto a plane and thought, oh God, I don't know if I'm really ready for this. So you've all seen slides like this before. Just another piece of evidence about adolescent brains changing. At birth, you've got these neurons, 100 billion of them at birth, and they connect with each other partly because of genetic programming, but partly because of experience, so that by 6 years of age, you've got this very rich, intricate network of connections between neurons, which means that the neurons can send information about what's going on where they are to what's going on elsewhere based on what function they serve, connecting it to the functions that the others serve. And then by 14 years of age, there are actually fewer connections. And that's a phenomenon called pruning. And it is not because that 14-year-old did a lot of drugs and drank a lot of alcohol. Could be, I suppose. But it's because the process of pruning means selecting for retention the synapses or the connections that are being used a lot and getting rid of the ones that aren't. Some of this can be getting more streamlined and effective. And this is one of the things that I think is so great about getting old is like, I'm hoping someday I'll be wise because I won't have all those extra connections in the way and I can just like see straight through the trees of the forest, right, someday. But some of the pruning happens if there just isn't the kind of enriched experiences. So it's both. It's more efficient, more effective in enriched environments, but there's also loss of connections in deprived environments. And this slide makes it clear that the location of these changes in the connections of brain cells happens at different times in different parts of the brain. So the first curve here, the dotted line, shows a sudden increase in the number of connections between brain cells in the part of the brain responsible for seeing and hearing at 4 to 5 months of age, which fits with what I told you about the 4-month-old whose eyesight gets a whole lot more focused further out. The second curve is at 9 months of age, sudden increase in the number of brain cell connections in the parts of the brain responsible for speech. Now you might be thinking, we're not talking at 9 months, usually. My son actually said no then. That was warning sign. 9 months, the wiring is being put in place. And they are speaking because they're pointing. At 9 months, they're talking to you, and they understand what you're saying. And then this last curve is a sudden increase in the number of connections between brain cells in the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for insight, impulse inhibition, judgment, and planning. And I show you this slide because there is another sudden increase in the number of connections between brain cells in the prefrontal cortex during adolescence. So it doesn't all get wired up at age 2 or 3. You got to do a little bit more impulse control than when you were 18 months. But there's a whole other period of growth during early adolescence where the wiring comes in place. And then you got to play with what you got. You got to play with that wiring. So We talked about prefrontal cortex synaptogenesis, amygdala versus frontal lobe role in facial expression recognition. So this may sound really complicated, but let's make it really simple. When you look at faces, faces give you lots of information, unless you've spent your whole life texting on your phone, in which case you don't know what they're telling you. But during adolescence, the information you get is processed primarily by the fight or flight alarm center of the brain. And towards adulthood, the wiring gets connected to the frontal lobe and to the parts of the cerebral cortex in the frontal lobe that are able to give you other kinds of inputs on what are you really seeing and what should you really do about it? How about maybe not flight or fight fear reaction? There might be other ways of responding to this. So that is another big change that happens in late adolescence, and it does speak to some of the vulnerabilities that adolescents have. And I would say this is now being pretty radically heightened by the deprivation of social interaction with digital technology. Myelinization is a more steady process that allows for more rapid transmission of signals in the brain, but it continues on through to early adulthood and then pruning, the streamlining we talked about. So there's a lot of stuff happening. It's not like it's all done after age 3 or age 6. And here, this last one, way too many words, but the idea is there actually is a shift in the activity of neural networks with particular neurochemical transmitters that favor novelty seeking and risk taking. So the brain is actually, as we understand it now, and the research changes and things get disproven, but as we understand it now, is actually changing during adolescence so that there is more drive to seeking novelty and taking risks. They're set up to be doing their job, not their fault. And if they're going to be in the world, they've got to really expand their horizons and learn about what's going on. So now that we have that sense of what's really going on, I want to talk about the touch point of adolescence from the parent's perspective. And remember earlier I said stressors on parents of adolescents, you tell me. Well, here's what some of the things I've been thinking about are. So as children mature into adolescence, they start looking at you differently. They start judging your behavior differently. They have a whole different set of standards. They have a whole new cognitive capacity to be looking at you and what you're up to. And they'll call you on it. Or they might not, but they'll take note. It goes on their balance sheet, right? And that's also their job. If you think about the 4-year-old, looks up at daddy, and he's so big and so tall and so strong, even if you're not, right? Superman. And mommy, she will do everything in her power to nurture and protect and comfort and feed and console and superwoman, right? That's 4-year-olds idealize. And the world is really pretty terrific if that's who's responsible for you, right? But that changes, and it needs to, and it has to, as the ability to compare to standards of fairness and right and wrong comes online. And that means that parents fall off their pedestal. And it also means that adolescents feel kind of shocked, betrayed, angry, and maybe scared. Well, who is going to protect me once the curtain gets pulled back and I can see who they really are, all of their flaws and all of their limitations? Means being pulled back into your own adolescence. Everybody nods their head when I say that. And I think adolescence is pretty tough for a lot of us. I think in a way, for those of us who grew up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it probably was tougher than maybe for kids who grew up after that. I don't know. We'll find out. They'll tell us. There's this sense, of course, giving up control because they've got more. And you lose some supports from your peers as parents, because you're supposed to know how to do it by now. When, childbirth education classes and mommy groups and stuff, you don't get, how many people get to do that when their kid's 14? The mold is set, it counts now. This is who my kid is. I can no more shaping or anything. And what they do, they could get a criminal record. They could never get into college or whatever the things that we value. Their behaviors count. Adolescent sexuality, need we say more? What am I supposed to do? How do I talk about it? Are there things that I can or can't protect for? And this all corresponds to predictable midlife questioning for parents as they feel the surge of their child's readiness to be in the world and realize themselves. Parents are looking at, I'm probably halfway through my life now, right? And it's a whole different sense of potential. I told you I was going to talk about emotions. And then there's separation and loss. And just as I said, I don't think adolescence is about independence and separation in the ways that the mainstream culture has set forth. The changes feel like separation and loss, and the reality of children leaving home is extremely painful. Except that after, I don't know if this is true for everybody, I'll just say, I have often heard that 6 months after the last child leaves, the first 6 months are terrible. You just are besides yourself. Your life is over and you've lost your babies and you're so old. And then at the 6 months, it's interesting how grief seems to take 6 months. 6 months later you realize, wow, we can do whatever we want now. It's like being 16. So in the pre-adolescent touchpoints, just a couple of things to alert you to. Starts earlier than you think. 8 or 9 years of age, there's variability, but way before you see the physical manifestations. And often the first thing you see is the child's irritability. And it's the irritability added to the, I get who you are now, you can't pull the wool over my eyes anymore, I see all your flaws and limitations. It is expressed in this angry, irritable way often. So it really pushes parents' buttons, and then what do parents do? They lash out or they withdraw. Not fun to be with you. And that is, it's unfortunate that nature has designed it that way, because I think it's the opposite of what needs to happen. I think what needs to happen is to stay in the messiness and hold on to the relationship. And as adults, I think it's our responsibility, and we're probably better positioned to do that. So to put it together, I think there are just a couple of very simple things. In adolescence, they are constructing their identities. The Erickson term is identity formation. I like to say identity construction, like they're actually doing it, they're working on it. And so all of the negative ideas about adolescence get in the way and become self-fulfilling prophecies. So there is this opportunity as we are in this family system or school system as the guardrails, setting the conditions for where they could go. It's our job to provide them as many opportunities and as much reflecting back of, this is who you can be. And that's why some of the most effective interventions in adolescence have been adolescents that focus on giving kids a sense of purpose, a sense of their own value. And as I said before, unfortunately, with this idea that adolescents are supposed to be in school buffing their grades and their CV to get into college, it's as if those years deprive them of the experience every day of having a sense of purpose and a sense of value. And I bet a lot of you get to go to work every day and feel like, I'm so lucky because I got to do something that really makes a difference, and you feel good. And I think people need that much earlier in life. And I think that part of the adolescent struggle is that we get in the way of their experiencing that, and to support their identity construction, we should really be emphasizing the opportunities for them to feel like, I do have a purpose. And there have been studies of interventions that do that have shown all kinds of really important improvements in academic outcomes, behavioral outcomes, as well as protection against the kinds of things that we worry about. And then the parents are dorks. I actually remember hearing this in the car when I was driving my daughter and her friend somewhere. I don't know anyone who thinks their parents are normal. Yeah, right. So the worst part is that I know someday I'll be just like them. Yeah. So part of, I think, what we're working on is helping it not look that bad to be just like us. So there's that. There's the sense of purpose. These are some of the programs, and they're in the handouts, and they'll be on the website. And the other is staying in conversation. I think earlier I had used the term staying connected for this talk, but I changed it to staying in conversation. Because with digital technology, staying connected means we'll text each other. And that's not going to work. Staying in conversation takes the work of listening, being silent, being present, attending to the nonverbal information you're providing and trying to figure out what you're getting. Staying in that conversation even when it gets messy. And there's a body of research that shows that, wait, where'd I go? I'm looking at it in the wrong direction. Here you go. This research asks these questions. Most of the time your parent is warm and loving to you. You are satisfied with the way your parent and you communicate with each other. Overall, you are satisfied with your relationship with your parent. But that's what I'm talking about, staying in the conversation. What was one of the most important measures of that? That they actually had meals together. Guess what happens at meals now? If most people actually aren't having meals together, not having meals together. And if they do, guess who's at the table with the family? The phones, yeah. And in Sherry Turkle's book, she's really clear, we don't have to give in to this. We can reclaim conversation. So this led to statistically significant improvements in all of the things that we worry about for adolescents, and this hasn't changed. So I will stop by telling you a story that I think I alluded to telling you about a little thing we can do in our communities. And it's a story that maybe isn't one that's easily relatable to everybody, but I do hope there are ways that we can make it. In our community, after school ends in the 4th grade, and then you have latchkey kids. They're 10. So we started talking with the parents of our kids' friends and said, do you want to do this? Like, are you ready for a kid to come home? And everyone said, no, really, we're not ready. So we decided we would come together and pool a little bit of money to hire someone to be at the school to pick up the kids, and that we would take turns having the kids at each one of our houses each day. And you could do it in a place like a library or in the school of the school-provided space. I don't think it's out of reach for people with different resource levels. Because what really mattered, actually, was getting together with the parents. And we realized, oh, we're going to all be responsible for each other's kids. So, like, what are your rules? And what do you value? And what do you allow? And how much screen time and all of that? And being able to like work out the differences and get to consensus on that, and then to tell the kids, guess what, this is what we all decided, was a really powerful way of creating this set of guardrails for them. And so we did it for 5th grade, we did it for 6th grade, we did it for 7th grade, and they were kind of like, really? And then for 8th grade, they said, you're not going to make us do this again for 8th grade. We're going to be in 8th grade. And we said, oh, yeah, we are. And I think they were actually really grateful that we stood up to their indignation to say, we're going to hold you in this way. It'll be different. This year you'll have more time to do this on that on your own, but you're going to be held this way. So then we had a cookout before 9th grade, and the kids said, you guys are not going to keep on doing this to us when we're in high school. And we figured, yeah, probably we're not, which is this getting ready for the messiness. But guess what? We all been talking, all as parents, about like what's going to go on in high school, and when you say you're going to so-and-so's house, we're going to take the liberty of calling up and making sure that the parent's there and a bunch of other things. And I have to tell you, they all looked really relieved. And their expression of protest really felt more like appreciation. Thank you very much.